Let's just read today. It's Friday, and it's the trial. Chapter 5. Judge Henry Gantry tugged on the right sleeve of his long black robe to adjust it properly, then stepped through the massive oak door behind the bench of his courtroom. A bailiff yelled, "All rise for the court!" Everyone, spectators, jurors, lawyers, clerks, and all the participants in the trial, bolted to their feet in one scramble. As Judge Gantry was establishing himself in his throne-like chair, the bailiff quickly rattled off his standard call to order. "Hear ye, hear ye. The criminal court of the 10th District is now in session. The Honorable Henry Gantry presiding. Let all who have matters come forth. May God bless this court." "Please be seated," Judge Gantry said loudly into the microphone before him. Just as suddenly as the crowd had jumped to its feet, it suddenly fell back in one collective motion. Chairs squeaked, benches cracked, purses and briefcases were rearranged, and the 200 or so people all seemed to exhale at once. Everything was quiet. Judge Gantry quickly surveyed the courtroom. As expected, it was filled to capacity. "We certainly have a lot of interest," he said today. "Thank you for your presence." He glanced up at the balcony. He made eye contact with Theo, who then smiled at the presence of his classmates sitting shoulder to shoulder, all frozen at attention. "The matter at hand is the case of the state versus Mr. Peter Duffy. Is the state ready to proceed?" Jack Hogan, the prosecutor, stood and announced, "Yes, Your Honor, the state is ready." Clifford Nance rose and solemnly said, "We're ready, Your Honor." He's the defense. Judge Gantry turned to his right, looked at the jury, and said, "Now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you were selected last week, and when you left here, I gave you specific instructions not to discuss the case with anyone. I warned that if someone tried to approach you and discuss the case, you were to notify me. I now ask, has this happened? Has anyone had contact about the case?" All jurors shook their head in the negative. "Good. We have disposed of pre-trial motions, and now we're ready to begin. At this stage of the trial, both sides will have the opportunity to address you directly and make what we refer as opening statements. An opening statement is not proof, not evidence, just a summary of each side's version of what happened. Since the state has the burden of proving guilt, the state goes first. Mr. Hogan, are you ready?" So that's Judge Gantry instructing the jury about the case. "Yes, sir. You may proceed." Theo had been unable to eat breakfast, and he'd slept very little. He'd read many stories of athletes who were so nervous they couldn't eat or sleep before a big game. They were overcome with queasy stomachs brought on by fear and pressure. Theo could certainly feel the pressure right now. The air in the courtroom was heavy and tense. Though he was only a spectator, he had butterflies. This was the big game. Mr. Hogan was a career prosecutor who handled major cases in Strattonburg. He was tall, he was wiry, he was bald, and he wore a black suit every day. Behind his back, folks joked about his black suits. No one knew if he had only one or a couple dozen. But though he rarely smiled, he began his opening statement with a friendly "Good morning," and he introduced himself and the two younger prosecutors at his table. Nice job breaking the ice, Theo thought. Then he got down to business. He introduced the victim, Myra Duffy, by showing the jury a large color portrait of her. She was 46-year-old when she was murdered, the mother of two sons, Will and Clark. They're both college students. I'd like for them to stand. He pointed to the front row directly behind the prosecution's table, and the two young men stood awkwardly and looked at the jurors. Theo knew from the newspaper reports that their father, her first husband, had been killed in a plane crash when they were little boys. Mr. Duffy was her second husband, and she was his second wife. People like to say that there was a lot of remarrying out at the creek. Mr. Hogan was describing the crime. Mrs. Duffy had been found in the living room of the large contemporary home she shared with Mr. Duffy. It was a new home, less than 3 years old, and it was on a wooded lot that backed up on the golf course. Because of all the trees, the house was barely visible from the street. Then the same could be said of most of the homes at Waverly Creek. Privacy was important out there. When her body was found, the front door of their home was unlocked and open. The alarm system was in standby mode. Someone had taken her jewelry from her closet, a set of antique watches owned by Mr. Duffy, 3 handguns from the drawer by the television of the den. The estimated value of the missing loot was about $30,000. The cause of death was strangulation, With the approval of Judge Gantry, Mr. Hogan stepped up to a projector, hit a button, and a large photo appeared on the screen opposite the jury. It showed Mrs. Duffy lying on the carpeted floor, dressed, seemingly untouched, her high heel shoes still on her feet. Mr. Hogan explained that on the day she was murdered, a Thursday, she had a luncheon date at noon with her sister. Apparently, she was ready to leave the house when she was attacked. Her murderer then went through the house, took the items that were missing, and left. Her sister began calling Mrs. Duffy's cell phone, 10 calls over the next 2 hours, and became concerned enough when she drove to Waverly Creek to the Duffy home, she found her sister. As far as crime scenes go, this one looked actually not that bad. The victims could have simply fainted. At first, her sister and the police thought she had died of a heart attack, or a stroke, or some other natural cause even. Given her age, fitness, and no history of drug abuse, they very quickly became suspicious. The autopsy revealed the true cause of death. The person who killed Mrs. Duffy grabbed her from behind, pressed firmly on her carotid artery. That's there in the neck. Mr. Hogan placed his fingers against his own carotid artery on the right side of his neck. 10 seconds of firm pressure in just the right place, and you lose consciousness, he said. Then he waited while everyone else to see if he might collapse himself right there in the court. But he didn't. He continued. Once Mrs. Duffy passed out, her killer kept pressing firmer and firmer, and 60 seconds later she was dead. There's no signs of struggle, no broken fingernails, no scratches, nothing. Why? Because Mrs. Duffy knew the man who killed her. Mr. Hogan dramatically turned and glared at Mr. Duffy, who was seated between Clifford Nance and another defense lawyer. She knew him because she was married to him. There was a long, heavy pause, and the entire courtroom looked at Mr. Duffy. They could see the back of his head. He wanted desperately to see his face. Mr. Hogan continued. He was able to get so close because she trusted him. Mr. Hogan stood by the projector and displayed more photographs. Using them, he laid out the entire scene. The interior of the house, the front door, the rear door, the close proximity of the golf course, the entrance to Waverly Creek, its heavy gates. He explained it was highly unlikely that an intruder, even a clever one, would breach all that security. Unless, of course, the intruder was not an intruder, but was a person who lived there. None of the neighbors saw a stranger or saw a strange vehicle leave the Duffy home. No one saw a stranger walking the streets or running from the house. Nothing unusual was reported. In the past 6 years, there had been 2 burglaries at Waverly Creek. Crime was virtually unheard of in this quiet community. On the day of the murder, Mr. Duffy played golf. He did that every Thursday. He teed off at 11:10 a.m., which, according to the computer log in the golf shop, he was alone, which was not as unusual, and he used his own electric golf cart. He told the course starter that he planned to play 18 holes, the North 9 and the South 9, the 2 most popular courses. The Duffy home bordered the 6th fairway of the Creek course, a smaller course preferred by the ladies. Mr. Duffy was a serious golfer who always kept score, and he didn't cheat. Playing 18 holes alone usually took about 3 hours. The day was overcast, cool, windy, weather that would discourage most people from playing golf. Other than a foursome that had teed off at 10:20, there was no one else on the 3 courses at 11:10. Another 4 teed off at 1:40. Mrs. Duffy's sister found her immediately and called 911. The call was recorded at 2:14 p.m. The autopsy placed her time of death at 11:45. With the help of an assistant, Mr. Hogan set up a diagram of Waverly Creek community. He identified the golf course, the golf shop, the driving range, the tennis court. Then he showed the jury the location of the Duffy home on the Creek course. According to tests the state had performed, Mr. Duffy was either on the 4th or 5th hole. Mr. Duffy was on the 4th or 5th hole of the North 9 at the time of his wife's murder. Riding in a golf cart identical to the one he owned, Mr. Duffy, a person could travel from that part of the course to the Duffy home in about 8 minutes. Peter Duffy looked at the diagram and slowly shook his head as if Mr. Hogan was full of nonsense. He was 49 years old with a dark, scowling face, topped by thick, graying hair. Jack Hogan drove the point home that Mr. Duffy knew his wife was home, and obviously had access to his own house. He was in a golf cart only minutes away at the time of the murder, was playing golf at a time where the course was practically deserted. His chances of being seen were very slim. He planned it very well, Mr. Hogan said, over and over. The mere fact that a good lawyer kept saying that Mr. Duffy killed his wife made his theory almost sound believable. Repeat something enough, and folks will start believing it. How does a courtroom work, right? Mr. Mount had always taken the position that the presumption of innocence is a joke. The presumption of guilt is one also. And Theo had to admit it. It was difficult to think of Mr. Duffy in terms of innocence, at least in these very opening minutes of the trial. Why would Mr. Duffy, though, kill his wife? Mr. Hogan posed his question to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, the jury, it's obvious. Money. This is a life insurance policy for $1 million purchased by Mr. Peter Duffy 2 years ago, ensuring the life of his late wife, Myra. Silence. The guilt seemed to grow heavier. Mr. Hogan flipped through the policy as discussed it, and he seemed to lose some steam. When he was finished with it, he tossed it back on the table, and then he launched into a rambling discussion of Mr. Duffy's business woes. Woe. W-O-E. It's a cool word. Woe and woes. Means troubles. His business woes. Woe? That's a different woe. That's W-H-O-A. This is W-O-E. Woe. He was a real estate developer who scored big, but he had also lost big. And at the time of his wife's death, he was being squeezed by some banks. Mr. Hogan promised the jury that the state would prove that the defendant, Peter Duffy, was on the verge of going broke. He needed money, as in life insurance money. There was one more on the subject of motive. Mr. Hogan had said that the jury would learn that Mr. Duffy's marriage had not been a happy one. There were problems, and lots of them. They had separated on 2 occasions. Both had hired divorce lawyers at one point, though neither one ever filed. To wrap things up, Mr. Hogan said as possible as he could to the jurors and gave them a serious look. This was a cold-blooded murder, ladies and gentlemen, perfectly planned and executed. Not a hitch, not a witness, no evidence left behind. Nothing but a lovely woman who lost her life. And I forgot something. I forgot to tell you that 2 years ago, when Mr. Duffy bought the life insurance policy, he'd also been playing golf alone. He seldom played alone before then. We'll bring in witnesses to prove that. Isn't that a coincidence? He planned this for 2 years, quietly fitting his golf game around his wife's schedule. Just waiting for a cold and windy day so the course would be empty. Waiting for the perfect moment to sprint home, park his cart next to the patio, hustle to the back door. Hi, honey, I'm home. Grab her when she wasn't looking. He had planned this for so long, he knew just what to do. He grabbed the jewelry, grabbed his expensive watches, grabbed the guns, so the police would think it was the work of a burglar. Seconds later, he was out the door, back on the golf court, flying along the fairways to number 5 on the North 9, where he took a 4-iron, casually hit a nice shot, and finished a lovely game of golf. Mr. Hogan paused. All was silent. He packed up his legal pad and returned to his seat. Let's take it 90 minutes had passed during all this. Judge Gantry rapped his gavel. 10-minute recess. Just like at school. Recess. Just means a break. Mr. Mount gathered his class at the end of the narrow hallway on the 2nd floor. The boys were excited. This is better than television. All right, said Mr. Mount. You've only heard one side of the case. Just for fun, though, how many of you think he's guilty? 12 hands shot up. Theo wanted to vote yes for guilt, but he knew it was too soon. What about the presumption of innocence? Mr. Mount said. He did it, said Darren. He's guilty, said Brian. There's no way he's getting off. He planned it perfectly. He did it. Okay. We're going to have the same conversation during lunch break, but after you've heard the other side. The other side began with a bang. Clifford Nance waited until the courtroom was quiet before he walked to the jury box. He had gray hair over his ears. He had thick arms and chest and a swagger. Not a shred of evidence, he said. Not a shred of evidence. Theo caught himself flinching at his loud, booming voice. Nothing. No witnesses. No crime-proof scene. Nothing but this clean, neat, tidy little story Mr. Hogan shared with you. Not one word of it is evidence. Just his fanciful version of what might have happened. Maybe Peter Duffy wanted to kill his wife. Maybe even planned it. Maybe even raced around an empty golf course. Maybe arrived home just in time to pull off one of the cleanest crimes in history. Then maybe he stole some things, left open the door, and raced back to the fifth tee. Maybe that's what's happened. Mr. Nance was pacing now, slow before the jury. Perfect rhythms to his words. Mr. Hogan is asking you, ladies and gentlemen, to play the maybe game. Maybe this happened, maybe that happened. All he wants to do is play along because he has no proof. He has nothing. Nothing but a man playing golf alone, minding his business, while his wife loses her life in their lovely home less than a mile away. He stopped pacing, walked close to the jurors. He picked out an elderly gentleman on the front row. He lowered his voice and said, I don't blame Mr. Hogan for playing the maybe game. He has no choice because he has no evidence. He has nothing but a very vivid imagination. Mr. Nance shuffled to his right and made eye contact with a middle-aged woman. Our Constitution, our laws, our rules of procedure, they're built on the ideas of fairness. And guess what? There's no room for maybes. Our laws are clear. Judge Gantry will explain them later. And when he does, listen carefully. You will not hear him utter the word maybe a single time. What you'll hear is very well known and time-honored, old-fashioned American rule that says when the state accuses of a crime, the state must walk in here with investigators, police, experts, prosecutors, crime scene analysts, all these smart and experienced people, and prove beyond a reasonable doubt, that you did commit this crime. Mr. Nance shuffled to his left and looked sincerely at the six jurors in the second row. He spoke with no notes. His words were smooth. Beyond a reasonable doubt. I'm going to say it one more time. Beyond a reasonable doubt. The state has a heavy burden it cannot possibly meet in this case. He paused while everyone took a breath. He walked to the defensive table. He picked up a yellow pad and he didn't look at it. He was an actor on center stage and he knew his lines by memory. He cleared his voice. The law says that Pete Duffy does not have to testify, does not have to call witnesses in his defense. He doesn't have to do anything. Why is this? It's simple. He's protected by one of the most cherished safeguards. It's called the presumption of innocence. Pete Duffy sits here, an innocent man. Same as you, same as me. However, Pete Duffy will testify. He wants to testify. He can't wait to testify. And when he takes that seat there on the witness stand, he will testify under oath, and he will tell you the truth. The truth, ladies and gentlemen, is something different than the little story Mr. Hogan just created. The truth is that Pete Duffy was playing golf on that fateful day, and he was alone. His preferred way of playing. The records will reflect that he teed off at 11, drove away from the first tee in his own golf course, one that he keeps in his own garage, as do most of the neighbors. He was on the course alone when his wife was home getting ready to leave for a lunch in town. A thief, some unknown criminal who's still at large, and will remain so at this rate, entered the home quietly, mistakenly thought no one was home. The alarm was off. The front door was unlocked, as was the back door, but this was not uncommon in this neighborhood. The thief encountered Myra Duffy, attacked her with his hands because he had no weapon. At that point, he became something else. He was no longer a burglar, he was a murderer. Mr. Nance paused and walked to the defense table. And he's still out there, ladies and gentlemen. Or he could be here. Since we're playing the maybe game, let's say this, and maybe he's here. Maybe he's watching this trial. Why not? He's safe for Mr. Hogan and his gang. Theo noticed that several of the jurors glanced towards the spectators. Mr. Nance shifted gear and talked about the life insurance policy, and specifically the fact that Mr. Duffy hadn't purchased one, made him the recipient of $1 million in the event of his wife died, but there had been an identical policy on his life, naming Mrs. Duffy also the recipient if he should die. They'd simply done what most married couples do. They purchased dual policies. He promised to prove to the jury that Peter Duffy's business affairs were not nearly as dire as Mr. Hogan claimed. He admitted that the Duffys had struggled with their marriage, and they had separated, but they had never filed for divorce. In fact, they were determined to work through their differences. Mr. Mount sat in the second row of the balcony behind his students. He chose a spot carefully so he could see all of them. So far, they had been riveted by the opening statements, but not surprisingly, it was Theo who paid attention the most. He was exactly where he wanted to be. When Mr. Nance finished, Judge Gantry called for an early lunch recess. All right, the trial goes on into chapter 6. That was chapter 5. But you guys have been giving this a really strong effort, and I've been stringing out a lot of reading. I will do chapter 6 on Monday, and it's the trial continued. The trial continues for one more chapter. It'll probably take just about as long, 20 minutes. On Monday, we'll just get to reading 2. Thank you for joining me. How does a courtroom work? Well, we just heard it. Pre-trial motions, the opening statements, presumption of innocence. It's good you guys know. How does a courtroom work?